Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing it's basically high school advanced writing, but our focus is on grade 8. So, we're doing our English lesson, and we'll be doing it on semicolons, colons, and commas. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts. We're doing grade 8. It's basically high school advanced, but we're doing grade 8. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas. All right. So our chapter is semicolons, it's colons, and commas, sorry. Our subject is English Language Arts. We're doing grade 8. It is high school advanced writing, but grade 8, our focus is on grade 8. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas is to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists, and to use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. So that is going to be our lessons for today. All right. So when it comes to semicolons, colons, or commas, right? We're first going to go over what is a colon, what is commas, as well as semicolons, right? And if you look at, let's say, the sign, then basically, let's say colons, and it's almost like it's a combination of all three, right? It's almost like the three colons, commas, and semicolons. It's like they're swapping. It's like they were swapping signs. It's like, yes, you use this one, I use that one, right? Where the comma just uses a comma, where semicolon is like, let's say, a dot of the colon and a comma type of thing, right? So that is usually my idea that I get. So when it comes to a colon, right, or how we use a colon, we use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. All right. So a colon, right? We use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. And remember, an independent clause, right? It is basically like a sentence or clause that can stand on its own. It has a subject, it has a verb, right? And it is basically a complete sentence. So if a list, right? So if the list does not follow an independent clause, because remember we said a colon, it introduces a list after an independent clause. And remember after the independent clause. So we have the independent clause, colon, and then we have the list, right? But now, if a list does not follow an independent clause, right, then it means that we do not use punctuations to introduce the list. And we're going to look at an example of that, meaning that we're not going to use that colon to introduce the list. But let us look at that. Here it says, if you look at the first example, it says, my parents have visited much of Western Europe. That is the independent clause, the one that is underlined. My parents have visited much of Western Europe, right? And here we have our colon. Our colon is dot, dot. That is our colon. And now the list that comes after the independent clause, right? This is now the list of basically all of Europe or Western Europe that her parents or his parents have visited, right? Because here we have our independent clause once again that says, my parents have visited much of Western Europe. And now they're introducing all the places that the parents have been to, which is Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. So that is basically introducing all, or basically just giving the list of all the um, places that their parents have visited, you know, in the Western Europe. So then we basically add our colon because now we have our independent clause, right? And you have your colon, and now you're introducing everything. And you need to, once you introduce it, you basically put your commas. Because now remember, with a list, a series of words, we add commas to all of those series of words. And then the last one, we add and. But now look at the next example, right? Here it says, if a list does not follow an independent clause, do not use punctuations to introduce the list. Like here it says, my parents have visited much of the Western Europe, including. So now they are saying including, meaning that they are giving you a list, yes, but they are still following. The sentence is still going on, right? So the sentence is still going on by saying including, and now they're making mention of all the places that the parents have visited. So if you are going to use words like including or such as, and then it means that means that the sentence is still continuing. We do not add a colon in that case or in that sense, right? All right, then we have commas. We can use commas for a lot of things, right? We can use commas to separate three or more items in a series, like I might mention over here, where if you add more than one, like a list of certain things, we call that a series. And then it means that you need to add commas. And then before the last one, you put and. So we use commas to separate three or more items in a series. And then we need to put a comma after each item in the list, except for the last one. And that is where we said we add and by the last one. So we don't add a comma before Spain, for example, because and is there, because now we are ending off. And we ending. And if we look at an example, right, of how we use commas to separate three or more items within a series, then it says our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, Rachel Stein, and Linda Hu, right? So there we have three, a list of three people that will be the speakers. And before the last one, and we did not add a comma because we are now saying this is the last one and this person, period. Right? So that is why we use commas. We use commas to separate three or more items in a series. Remember, we also use commas within sentences to basically bring about a pause so that we don't have run on sentences, so that we don't just talk, talk, talk and read. And no, we use our commas to bring about a pause, to bring about, to separate, either sometimes independent clauses. We sometimes use commas to join sentences by using them in conjunctions, but we add comma conjunction. So commas can be used in different ways. Then we have a semicolon. We have a semicolon, and we use semicolons, and that is to separate items in a series when using commas and would be unclear. So we use semicolons to separate items in a series, right? When using commas would be unclear, such as when one or more item in the series already contains commas. And we're going to look at an example of how we can use it. All right. Once again, we said we use semicolons, and that is to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear, right? And we're going to look at how we can use it. If we look at this example, it says our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, an English professor, Rachel Stein, a print journalist, and Linda Wu, a blogger. So do you see what the semicolon did? Instead of just saying, right, here by the comma, year over year, when we separated three or more items, right, we said who the speakers are going to be. But now, if you are basically saying all the roles or the professions, right, then we can't say Kevin O'Malley, comma, English professor, comma, no, because now you need to, for example, say, this is the one speaker, the profession, and now we are showing that break between that one. Because if we're just going to put commas, 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 we're going to think that it is Kevin O'Malley, it is an English professor, it is Rachel Stein, it is a printer journalist, it is Linda Wu, and it is a blogger. That is basically what normal commas do. But a semicolon, right, it separates the items in series, yes, but it uses basically it separates it also when the commas is unclear, especially if there's more than one item in a series when there's or which already, sorry, contains a comma. Like for example, Kevin O'Malley, an English professor. Rachel Stein, comma, a print journalist. Linda Wu, comma, a blogger. All right. So this is the difference between semicolons, the difference between a colon, as well as commas, right? And like I say, yes, semicolons, colons, and commas, the punctuation mark, it kind of looks the same, right? It kind of looks the same, but I'm not sure if I should say the role it plays, it is different, right? And once again, before we go on to aplusstudents.ca, we said we use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. But if the list does not follow an independent clause, then we do not use a punctuation to introduce the list. And when we say it does not include an independent clause, then it means that we have now added words like including, such as, and now it means it just goes on and on and on without using our colon. Then we have commas, and we use commas to separate three or more items within a series, right? And remember, I did say that commas can also be used for other roles, but in this case, commas can be used to separate three or more items. And we need to put a comma after every item in the list, except for the last one. The last one we need to say, and then you, for example, write the last one. It's like, for example, I love apples, pears, bananas, and strawberries, right? So the and then brings about where we are now, where I'm telling you, like, only these ones. This is the last one, and this one, period. That is our commas, or how we use commas. And then lastly, we have our semicolons. And we said we use semicolons to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear, such as when one or more item in a series already contains commas. And here they made an example of our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, an English professor, Rachel Stein, a print journalist, and Linda Hu, which is a blogger. So basically, to separate all of the items, right, with a semicolon, it was separated because the name of the speaker plus its profession was already written with a comma, already contained a comma, right? So if we had to, for example, just put commas after everyone without, for example, after everything and everyone without putting a semicolon, and then it would have seen as if there's six speakers. Because then it would have seen as if Kevin O'Malley is a speaker. There's an English professor that's a speaker. Rachel Stein is a speaker. There's a print journalist that's a speaker. Linda Wu is a speaker as well as a blogger. Whereas the semicolon separates the three speakers plus the professions, right? So it gives us the three speakers, and it tells us what their profession is, right? All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca, where we are going to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists, and we're going to use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. All right. All right, so now we're here by the first one that says use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists, right? It says, okay, I'm not going to go over this again of what a colon is, what a semicolon is, as well as a comma. But if we were to look at the punctuation marks, right? And then we can say a colon is this two dots, dot, dot. That's a colon. This is a comma. That is a more commonly used one, comma, we use all the time. And then a semicolon, right, has a little dot on top and the comma at the bottom. So that is a semicolon, right? And that is why I was saying it looks as if these three, it's almost like they were saying, okay, you borrow me a dot, you borrow me the comma, okay, I'm going to keep two dot. It looks almost, it's to me it looks like that. Maybe it's just my overthinking mind. All right, so now we're going to look at an activity where we're either going to add commas, semicolons, or colons if needed, right? And then we are going to our test. All right, so now it says we need to either add commas, semicolons, or colons if needed, right? Otherwise, submit the text without any additional punctuations. So if we need to add a comma, semicolon, or colons, then we should. If not, then we just leave it as is. All right, so now it says some of history's most famous spies, including Francis Walsingham, who spied for Queen Elizabeth the First, Nathan Hale, who spied during the Revolutionary War, and Bell Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil War. If we look at that sentence, right? Here we need to add two punctuation marks. Are we going to add a comma? Are we going to add a semicolon? Or are we going to add colons? What are we going to add? Are we going to add commas? Are we going to add semicolons? Or are we going to add colons over there? And if we look at that specific sentence, right, then we are going to add semicolons. And the reason why we're going to add semicolons is because if we look at, let's say, for example, here it says some of the history's most famous spies, including Francis Walsingham, they already have a comma. Comma. What did Francis do? He spied for Queen Elizabeth the First. Then we have Nathan Hale, the one who spied during the Revolutionary War. And then we have Bell Boyd, the one who gathered intelligence during Civil War, which means that we are separating that three famous spies and who they spied for by using a semicolon, because the name of the person as well as what they spied for or who they spied for is already, it already contains a comma, right? So if we were going to add more commas, then it means that we were If we were going to add commas instead of semicolons, then it means it's almost like it was just going to go on and on and on and make it seem as if there were more spies other than Francis, Nathan, and Bell, right? All right, so we add semicolons. All right. Now, if we look at the next one, it says we need to either add commas, semicolons, or colons if needed, right? So after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times, the Professional Golfers Association of America Championship 5 times, the US Open 4 times, and the British Opera 3 times. What do you think we are going to add here? Are we going to add commas to separate the series? Are we going to add semicolons to separate the series? Or are we going to add colons? What are we going to add to separate those series? Commas, semicolons, or colons. And that is to separate the series. What are we going to use? And if we look at the series, right? And then we are going to use commas. And the reason why we are going to use commas to separate those series, right, is because they are basically telling us all the tournaments or the things that he won, right? It says after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won. So now they're telling us all the things that he won. All right. They're mentioning all the things that he won. So which means that we are going to add commas to list the series of things that Nicholas has won or Jack Nicklaus has won. Which means that after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times, comma, that's one thing. The Professional Golfers Association of America championship 5 times, that is also something that he won. He also won the US Open 4 times, and he won the British Open 3 times. So, which means that we then need to separate it with a comma because they are listing a series of things that he had won, right? So, remember when it comes to colons, semicolons, and commas, you just need to look at basically what we were mentioning earlier on, as into how to use a comma, semicolon, or colon. Remember, we said with a colon, we add a colon after an independent clause. Once you have listed your things after the independent clause, right? We use a comma to list a series of words if there's three or more. And then we use semicolons, right? If the use of commas is unclear, and now we use semicolons. All right. So now let's go to our test where we're going to either use semicolons, colons, and commas. All right. And now it says we need to either add a comma, a semicolon, or a colon if needed. It says Mr. Dotson grows a variety of medicinal herbs in his garden. Chamomile. Oh, that word is very big. Lavender, feverfew, and lemon balm. Those are the medicinal herbs that he grows in his garden. We need to add either a comma, semicolon, or colon. What are we going to add there since the list is after something? Are we going to use a colon, option one, a space, option two, or colon, option three? Which one are we going to use? Colon, or are we just going to leave the space as is? So we need to say which one is correct. Are we using a colon, or we're just leaving it as a space? All right. And if we were to choose the correct option, right, as to what we are going to be using, then we're going to use a colon because we are going to use a colon after the independent clause. So that's the independent clause. Mr. Dodson grows a variety of medicinal herbs in his garden, and then his list of things are after the independent clause. So we're going to use a colon. All right. All right, look at the next one. It says we need to either add commas, semicolons, or colons. It says when Vince went to France, he visited the palace of Versailles. Is it that word? The Père ooh, Lachaise Cemetery, where his favorite writer Oscar Wilde is buried, and Lavar. Oh, guys, I think these are French words. So we now need to either add commas, semicolons, or colons. So now are we going to use option one, semicolons, option two, a space, or option three, a colon? So what are we using? Are we adding semicolon or are we adding a colon, basically? All right. And we'll go with semicolons, right? Because they specifically said he visited where his famous writers was buried, right? So the commas were going to be unclear. All right, let's look at the next one. It says some of history's most famous spies include Francis Walsingham, who spied for Queen Elizabeth I, Nathan Hale, who spied during Revolutionary War, and Bal Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil war. We need to either use semicolons, a space, or a colon to separate those series. Are we using a semicolon? Are we using a colon? Or are we just using a space? Which one are we using? All right, and if we were to use or to choose the correct punctuation mark to use, and then we're going to go with semicolons, right? So we use a semicolon. All right. Now we're going to the next one. It says, after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times, the Professional Golfers Association of America Championship 5 times, the US Open 5 times, and the British Opera 3 times. Do we have to add commas to separate those series? Do we have to just leave it as a space, option 2, or do we have to add a colon, option 3? Which one do we have to use? Which punctuation mark? All right, and if we were to choose the correct punctuation mark, and then we will say we're going to add commas because that is basically just showing all of the tournaments and things that he has won. All right. Oopsie. Okay, so now let's go to the next one where we're going to use semicolons. We're going to use, basically, we're just going to use semicolons and commas to separate the clauses, right? So we're either going to use a semicolon or we're going to use a comma to separate our clauses. It says, all right, so here it says, use a comma to separate two independent clauses that are joined with a coordinating conjunction. And remember, I said earlier that commas can be used for different, uh, I'm not sure what word to use, but it can be used in different contexts, right? Not just to list a series. And then I might mention that a comma can also be used to separate two independent clauses. And then we basically add our comma and our conjunction, and that is basically to join our basically these two independent clauses, right? Or a comma can just basically be put in a specific sentence in order to bring a pause, in order to bring a break, because we don't want run on sentences, right? So here it says that we use a comma. So we use a comma, and this is to separate two independent clauses. These are two clauses that can stand on its own. But now, in order for us to basically join this, we can join it by making it one sentence, but then we need to basically use a coordinating conjunction to join these two sentences. And once we write down our coordinating conjunction in the middle of the two clauses, then we need to add our comma before that. All right. So it says we use commas to separate two independent clauses that are joined with a coordinating conjunction. And our coordinating conjunctions are words like and, or, but, so. However, if the coordinating conjunction joins verbs or verb phrases within a compound predicate, a comma should not be used. So we're going to look at the two sentences. Look at the first one. It says, remember an independent clause, right? Has a subject and it has a verb. It shows a complete sentence, right? So here it says, Wyatt was reserved around new people, comma, but he was hardly shy. So there we have our coordinating conjunction and comma to separate that two sentences, or basically to join that two sentences. But now here they're saying that if, for example, it is joined with a verb, right, or verb phrase in a compound predicate, then a comma should not be used. And that is like this one, where it says Wyatt was reserved around new people, but was hardly shy. Instead of saying he was hardly shy, we say was hardly shy, which means that we, the second one does not have a subject. So we need to not add our comma. Then we can also use a comma to separate dependent clauses and an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. And that means this is a complex sentence, right? So this is a complex sentence. So with a complex sentence, we have a dependent clause and we have an independent clause, right? And these dependent clauses, it usually starts with a subordinating conjunction. And there's a difference between a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions are words like and, or, but. So that is coordinating conjunction. Whereas the subordinating conjunctions, right? It is usually used when we have a dependent clause and we are joining it with an independent clause in a complex sentence. And our subordinating conjunctions are, just to mention a few, after, although, because, if, and so on and so on, right? So then we can use commas to separate those words within the sentences. All right. And if we look at an example, it says, although they starts with a subordinating conjunction, although Wyatt was reserved around new people, he was hardly shy. Right? So that is an example of how we can also use commas and how we can use commas with a dependent clause as well as an independent clause, but by using a subordinating conjunction. Right? All right, guys, we are going to continue with semicolons, colons, and commas in our next lesson because we have not just reached the end of our lesson on the use of semicolons, commas, as well as colons. So, thank you very much for joining the class. I really hope that you do have at least an idea of how to use a semicolon, right? How to use a colon and how to use a comma. We said we use commas in a series where there's three or more words and we use it to separate it, or we use it in a coordinate when we use a compound sentence. Then we use comma and our conjunction, or we can use a comma when we are joining a dependent clause with an independent clause and we have a subordinating conjunction. Colons we use often independent clause, and then we list our list of things after the clause. Then we use a colon. And a semicolon we use if the comma is unclear. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson. We will continue this in our next lesson. But for now, thank you very much for joining the class. And I really hope that you're going to have a good evening further.